What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today we're going to be doing a sliders video. Now we're going to be doing it a little bit differently than we normally do. We're going to start off by taking a look at a game that was played here on the slider sets. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the rushing stats. We came out with a pretty good rushing average yards per carry for the running back at around the user fumbling sliders had to be increased quite significantly to get past this point where we're fumbling multiple times per game. From the passing stats, Ben Roethlisberger had a perfect day, 158.3, 3 touchdowns, 327 yards, and his completion percentage was around 79%. The CPU's completion percentage was around 65%, so there are a couple of things to be said here about what's going on. So there are a couple of sliders that are going to get adjusted for this, and that is going to be the coverage sliders as well as quarterback accuracies, and we'll get into those. But a couple of things to note: we kind of need to nerf the quarterback's performance of the user team, and we kind of need to boost a little bit either the performance of the CPU quarterback, or we need to kind of nerf the performance of the user defenders. And then one more thing that I wanted to highlight here was the number of broken tackles for Najee Harris and Chris Carson. So we've gotten the sliders to a point where players are capable of breaking a tackle here and there on both sides of the ball, but they're not breaking a crazy number of tackles or anything like that. So that was one thing that I wanted to highlight. Now let's go ahead and dive into what everybody actually clicked on this video for, and that is the actual slider set. So whenever we played that game, we played on around 35 quarterback accuracy. Obviously Big Ben was a little bit too accurate, so we took it down to 32. Now we didn't nerf his performance too much because it was also partially the responsibility of the receivers. The receivers were coming down with every single catch, which again is a bit unrealistic, so we took the wide receiver catching back down to the base of 50, which I think in combination is going to give us a realistic catch percentage, relatively realistic catch percentage, as well as a relatively accurate quarterback completion percentage and accuracy on throws. Now, it's not going to be perfect. Like I said, this is kind of a starting point for Madden 22, and as updates and things happen, some things might change. Pass blocking, we took all the way down to 15. We might even take this a little bit lower, to be honest with you. Like I showed you, we had a pretty much perfect day passing. We weren't even sacked a single time. So that's the Pittsburgh Steelers offensive line. That is a whole bunch of 60s, and I'll cut in here real quick to show you their offensive line so you know what I'm talking about. If I can successfully have a perfect day passing the ball with a 66, 74, 70, 80, and 66 on the offensive line, especially those 66s playing offensive tackle, then you shouldn't have too much trouble playing on that 15 pass blocking. I know that the next rating that we took down was the run blocking down to 40. Now this is directly pulled over from my slider set for last year, and it worked wonderfully. Now moving on to fumbles, this is the slider that again you have to increase it to reduce the amount of fumbles. I know that everybody always gets confused on that one. We are trying to reduce the number of fumbles within a game, and so playing on the base of 50, you see a lot of sliders within the game. If you play with this slider up into the 50s and 60s, you still see quite a few fumbles, and too many for my liking and for realism purposes. So I think taking this up to about a 70 is going to be accurate. Next up, we're going to see our pass defensive reaction time and pass coverage. These are going to be a variation from last year. And so we noticed that the CPU quarterback had a tough time finding open wide receivers. Now that they were pretty accurate on that 10 quarterback accuracy that you see down there at the bottom of the screen. So what we decided to do in order to make it so that the CPU can move the ball, being that the Steelers don't have the greatest cornerbacks in the world, they should not be able to press and prevent the open receivers that they were able to in that game. So we took these down from 67 and 68, which they were on last year, down to about a 60. And now the next slider that is always controversial, we are taking interceptions down to 15. And I know everybody loses their mind whenever they can't just come up and make every perfect interception, but and so interceptions for us are down to 15 to try to make it more realistic, where you're not picking off every single pass. You can still get an interception, especially if you switch on. And especially if you switch on with somebody that has pretty good hands, you will still be able to get an interception. You're not going to drop every single one, but for the most part, you're not going to be coming down with interceptions all day long. Now, my last comment here on these pass defense sliders is for user versus user gameplay. 67 or 68 is probably going to be about where you want to be at. For user versus CPU gameplay, you're probably looking at about 60 here. So this is one of the sliders that is going to vary between whether you're playing users or you're playing CPU. If you are playing users, like I said, you might want to consider taking these up to about 67. You're going to get really nice pass coverage, really nice battles between wide receivers and defensive backs. Highly recommend that. But for user versus CPU gameplay, you're going to be looking at about 60. Most of these other ratings are going to stay the same. And then again, we're having a little bit of trouble with CPU players breaking too many tackles and user defenders not really being able to tackle as well as they should be able to tackle, so we take tackling up to around a 54. This doesn't take it up too high to where you're making every single tackle perfectly, but it gives a nice balance of some broken tackles, some missed tackles, but also the tackles that you should make, you do make. A lot of these sliders here as we go down through CPU skill are again going to be very similar to last year's. Quarterback accuracy down to 10. They still hit the majority of their targets on 10 accuracy. Now I could see a world in which we might want to increase this a little bit, but I think decreasing the CPU, or rather the user's pass coverage and pass defense reaction time is going to result in a really nice balance where the CPU is not completing all of their passes, but they are able to find open targets and move the ball down the field. As you guys saw in that game, Russell Wilson still did have a 65% completion, so the quarterbacks are still going to be effective on the field, especially with the pass coverage taken down a little bit for the users. Pass blocking is nearly the same as last year's. We had it down to 34 in last year's. I find that 35 is good enough to get a good pass rush with what I've been seeing in the various games that I've played. Honestly, you might have even, if you want to give yourself a bit of a challenge, do with putting this up. I'm a defensive line user for the most part, and so I find it pretty easy to get in the backfield and cause pressure and get sacks. So pass blocking could go up in mine and probably will go up a bit for my purposes, but 35 is a good jumping off point. Wide receiver catching down to 45. Now this is something that you could play around with anywhere between 45 and 50 depending on what you're seeing within your CPU leagues. I'm going to play on 45 for now because I think it gave me a really nice balance between CPU wide receivers making the catch and defensive backs being able to make a play on the ball. This is another one that is controversial. A lot of people see run blocking for the CPU all the way up to 70 and they think I'm crazy, but you guys saw it in that game. Chris Carson only averaged 3.7 yards per carry. If anything, this run blocking should probably go up somewhere around a 75 if we want to make it realistic. Now, I'm good at stopping the run against CPU especially. So, that kind of changes things up. If you're trying to get realistic stats, you're not so great at stopping the run, then this might change for you. But if you are solid at stopping the run like I am to achieve realistic ratings or realistic stats and things like that, you're probably going to want to have CPU run blocking somewhere in the 70 to 75 range, and that's where I'm going to leave it at for now until I make a determination of maybe it needs to go up even higher. Now, the CPU, in my opinion, I feel like doesn't fumble too much, but I feel like they fumble a little bit more than they probably should. I've gotten too many fumbles where we've returned them for touchdowns, and that is a big factor in making games blowouts against the CPU, and so I have CPU fumbling up to 63. Now, I've noticed that the user fumbles more than CPU players do, so that's why it's not as high as the user fumbling rating. So around 63 has been pretty successful for me so far, and I'm liking that one a lot. Next up are going to be the pass defense stats, sliders for the CPU, and so I have their pass defensive reaction and pass coverage at 67, which is pretty much the same as last year. Again, this is going to give the CPU a fighting chance and allow them to make realistic plays on the ball. However, I take their interceptions down to 20. Now, I have their interceptions down to 20 because I still want them to be able to intercept the ball at a higher rate than I can as a user, because they don't have somebody that can switch on to the players and make that play and time it. So that's kind of the difference there. So whereas the user interceptions are down to 15, could even go a little bit lower, the CPU interceptions are around 20. This depends on how you want to challenge yourself and things like that. You could even them out, but I'm going to play on around 20 because I think that's going to give me the most realistic results. And then the final slider here for the CPU is going to be 35 tackling. Again, I feel like this gives me a good balance between broken tackles and the ability to break tackles for the user versus not being able to break any tackles, which is kind of what the base slider is at. Now, there's not going to be a whole lot to change here on special teams. I'm taking field goal accuracy down to 45. The only other change here is going to be your punt accuracy down to 40. This is one, again, where I feel like it's too easy to coffin corner punt within the game. You take it down to 40, and it really sets the difference between a good punter in the league and a bad punter in the league. Now, the biggest sliders here to pay attention to are going to be injuries and fatigue. So injuries will start off at a base of 25, I believe. I've taken them down to 22. I feel like injuries just happen slightly too often in this game. I feel like it's every quarter or so I'm getting one, if not two, if not three injuries within the game, which is just too much, you know. And then fatigue, that game was played on about 70 fatigue, which you could see that players still weren't subbing in as much as they need to and as much as they should. So I took it up to 80, and I'm pretty confident that 80 is going to be a good point where you're actually going to see your backups coming in. The final thing within the game options section here is your minimum player speed threshold. The minimum player speed threshold, I'm leaving at 50 for now. I'm considering actually switching this up, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. First, I want to go through all of the penalty sliders, and then we'll come back to the player speed threshold because I think that that is going to be something that deserves its whole own discussion. These are pretty much exactly the same as last year's, and I've had pretty good success with the game so far on these settings. So we have offside set to 50, false start at 80, holding at 65, face mask at 50, defensive pass interference at 75. We have these set to on. We have illegal block in the back set at base. We have intentional grounding on, and we have roughing the passer set at base, as well as everything else set to on. Now, roughing the passer, I feel like is really good so far this year. Penalties, as always, need to be turned up because we're not getting enough of them, especially pass interference, which is like all the NFL is nowadays. You have to have this turned up to actually be able to see the penalties. Now, in terms of the minimum player speed threshold, I know a lot of people are going to be tempted to turn this down to increase the difference between slow players and fast players. However, I feel like on the base setting of 50, I already notice a tremendous difference between fast players and slow players. And so I'm looking to try to find a way with the player speed threshold to make it so that a player's skill matters more than just having speed. And that's one of the biggest issues with franchise modes is everybody goes out, trades for the fastest player, signs the fastest player, starts a 65 overall burner at wide receiver and makes them into a god. And so we're trying to prevent that, especially if you're trying to be realistic. So, you know, I am looking into changing this. As for right now, we're going to start on 50, but again, we're going to be doing some testing with that. Guys, that's all we had for you in today's video. Feel free to go back and pause it at any point, take a screenshot of the sliders so you know what they're at, and you guys can go test them out yourselves. Make sure you leave your feedback down in the comment section below. Leave a like on the video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more content, and as always, and I'll see you guys in the next one. I hope you have a good one.